There are things a barn can hold for 40 years that no living soul knows about. Not the wife it belonged to, not the daughter who grew up beside it, not the husband who walked past it every morning of her married life. My in-laws handed me that barn the way you hand a child a broken toy, smiling at one another over the top of my head. They wrote it into the settlement on the back of a paper napkin at their kitchen table the night after the funeral. And my brother-in-law signed his name with a flourish like a man giving away nothing. The barn was nothing to them. 3 walls leaning south, a roof that dropped its shingles in every windstorm, a floor stained dark from 60 years of cattle that hadn't stood there in a generation. They told me, in front of the whole family, that since I was so attached to that side property, I might as well have it. They said it the way you say go on, dear to a person you've already decided is foolish. My sister-in-law laughed into her napkin. My husband, God rest him, and I mean that with every breath, was not there to defend me, because he was the reason we were all sitting at that table in the first place. What none of them knew, what not one of them could have guessed, was that my father had walked into that barn the spring before he died. He had walked in alone, with a leather satchel under his arm, and he had stayed for the better part of a Saturday afternoon. He told me about it once, late, after he'd had 2 fingers of bourbon and the porch light was drawing moths. He said, Eleanor, if there ever comes a day when this family tries to take what's yours, you go to that barn. You find the 3rd joist from the north wall. You count back 2 boards. He said it the way a man says a prayer he's been carrying in his pocket for years. I didn't go that night. I didn't go for 3 weeks after the funeral. I went on a Tuesday in October, after the reading, after the laughter, after my brother-in-law clapped me on the shoulder on the way out and said, You enjoy that barn now, Ellie. If you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who worked while others took, the one your family looked past until the moment they wanted something, please do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Stay with me, because what I found beneath that 3rd joist did not just change my circumstances. It changed every single thing this family thought they knew about me, about my father, and about the land they had been so confident was already theirs. Section 1. The Farmer's Silent World. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 61 years old. I have lived on the Marsh family farm in Coffee County, Kansas, for 37 of those years, which is longer than my husband Samuel was alive when I married him, and longer than any of his siblings have ever lived in one place in their adult lives. The farm sits on 312 acres of mixed cropland and pasture, with a creek running through the southwest quarter and a stand of old bur oaks along the western fence line that my husband's grandfather planted in 1922. The house is a 2-story clapboard built in 1908, painted white every 12 years whether it needs it or not, with a wraparound porch that faces east toward the road and a kitchen window that looks out over the kitchen garden I have tended since the spring after my wedding. The barn they gave me as a joke, sits 240 feet north of the house, on a slight rise that catches the wind in winter and shades the cattle pens in summer, and it has been there since before any of them were born. I came to this farm at 24 years old, the daughter of a wheat farmer from Lincoln County 2 hours northwest. My father, Henry Caldwell, had spent his whole life on a smaller piece of ground than this one, and he had taught me everything a person can know about soil, about water rights, about the way a fence post tells you whether your neighbor is honest or careless, about the way you read a deed, and the way you read a man's face when he's lying about a deed. He was a quiet man. He was not unkind, and he was not soft. He was the kind of man who would stand at the end of a field at sunset and say nothing for 20 minutes, and then tell you the one thing you needed to know to get through the next 10 years. He did not approve of my marriage to Samuel Marsh. He did not say so directly. He shook Samuel's hand at the wedding, and he danced with me to one song, and he kissed my forehead before he drove home. But he stopped by the farm only twice in the first decade of my marriage, and both times he walked the fence lines alone, and both times he came back to the porch with a look on his face that I came to understand only much later. He saw the family I had married into before I did. He saw what was coming before I knew there was anything to see. Samuel was the youngest of 3. His brother, Calvin Marsh, was 14 years older and had moved to Kansas City the year after high school, where he had built a small but successful insurance agency and a much larger sense of his own importance. His sister, Nadine Marsh Hollister, had married a banker named Roy Hollister and lived in a brick house in Topeka with a circular driveway and a husband who never quite looked any of us in the eye. Both of them had spent their adult lives at a comfortable distance from the farm, returning for holidays and funerals and the occasional Sunday in summer when the weather was good and the photograph would look nice on a Christmas card. Neither of them had ever, in 37 years, baled a single bale of hay or pulled a single calf or sat up all night in the kitchen waiting on a vet to come out for a down cow in February. I had done all of those things. I had done them besides Samuel for the first 31 years of our marriage, and I had done them alone for the last 6, after the cancer came and a long, slow work of dying began, and Samuel could no longer lift the things he had lifted his whole life. I did not resent any of it. That is the first thing you need to understand about me. I loved Samuel Marsh, and I loved this land, and I had chosen both of them with my eyes open, and I had not once in 37 years woken up in that farmhouse and wished I were anywhere else. What I had also done, quietly, without telling anyone, was learn the farm in a way that none of his family had ever bothered to learn it. I knew which fields took water and which fields drowned. I knew the year the south pasture had been laid out and the year it had been resurveyed. I knew which fence line had been moved in 1968 and which one had been moved back in 1974. I knew that the original homestead deed, filed in 1889, by Samuel's great-grandfather Absalom Marsh, described a parcel that did not match in any meaningful way the parcel as it was now described in the county records, and I knew this because I had walked into the Coffee County Courthouse one afternoon in 1996 and asked the clerk if I could look at the original instruments, and she brought them out from a back room in a flat acid-free folder, and I had spent 4 hours with them in a notebook and a sharp pencil. I never told Samuel what I had found that day. I never told anyone. There was no need. The farm was running well, and Samuel and I were happy, and the questions raised by those original instruments could be answered by the people who needed to answer them when the time came. And as I sat at my own kitchen table that night with my notebook in front of me, I had a feeling that the time would come. My father had taught me to read a deed. He had also taught me that the people who do not bother to read a deed will, sooner or later, hand themselves into the position of owing something to the person who did. My father visited the farm one last time in April of the year he died. He was 83 years old. He had driven himself the 2 hours from Lincoln County in his old Ford pickup, and he had a leather satchel beside him on the bench seat, and he said he wanted to walk the property one more time before he could no longer walk anything. Samuel was already sick by then. He was in a chair on the porch wrapped in the blue blanket I had washed 3 days earlier, and he raised his hand to my father, and my father raised his hand back, and the two of them looked at each other for a long moment in the way of men who have not always agreed, but who have come to a kind of peace about it. My father walked the property alone for nearly 4 hours. I watched him from the kitchen window. For part of it, he went down to the creek, and he stood at the southwest fence line, and he came back up across the pasture and stopped at the old bur oaks. Then he went into the barn, and he stayed there for what I now know was the better part of 2 hours. And when he came out, his hands were dusty, and the leather satchel under his arm looked lighter than it had when he arrived. We sat on the porch that evening after Samuel had gone into bed. My father had 2 fingers of bourbon in a jelly jar, and the porch light was drawing moths. And cicadas were doing what cicadas do in Kansas in April. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "Eleanor, this is good ground." I said I knew. He said, "This is better ground than they understand." I said I knew that too. He said, "There are things about this place that even Samuel doesn't know. Things his father didn't know. Things his grandfather knew once and let slip." I waited. My father was not a man you rushed. He said, "If there ever comes a day when this family tries to take what's yours," and I want you to listen to me, Ellie, because there will be such a day. There's always such a day with families like this. You go to that barn. You find the 3rd joist from the north wall. You count back 2 boards in the floor. There's a piece I cut and replaced. It comes up if you know how to lift it. You'll find what I left there, and you'll find what was already there before I left mine. He did not say more than that. He finished his bourbon. He kissed my forehead. He drove home in the dark, which I had told him not to do, and he slept in his own bed that night. And 3 months later, in July, His heart gave out while he was sitting on his own porch in Lincoln County, and I drove up alone for the funeral because Samuel was too sick to travel. And when I came home, I did not tell Samuel what my father had said about the barn. There was no reason to. Samuel had enough to carry. Samuel died in late August, almost a year and a half after my father. The cancer took him slowly, the way it takes some people, in long, quiet stages that give you time to memorize the shape of a person's hand on the blanket and the particular sound of his breathing in the last hour before dawn. He died in our bedroom upstairs, in the bed we had shared for 37 years, with the window open and the sound of the cottonwoods moving in the wind. I sat with him until the morning. Then I made the calls. Calvin came down from Kansas City the next afternoon. Nadine came up from the peak of the morning after that. Roy Hollister came with her, in his pressed slacks and his good loafers, and he stood on the porch of my farmhouse and looked out over the land with a particular expression of a man calculating something. I had seen that expression on his face before, twice. Once at our 25th anniversary party, and once at Samuel's diagnosis dinner, and I knew what it meant. I made coffee for them. I served pie. I sat at my own kitchen table and listened to my husband's brother and sister talk about the farm as though I were not in the room, and I understood, in that very long afternoon, that the day my father had warned me about was beginning. The farm community in Coffee County is a small one. People know one another the way people know one another in places where the same families have farmed beside one another for 4 and 5 generations. The neighbors began arriving the next day with casseroles and condolences, and what I noticed, what I had been noticing for years, but what came into very sharp focus that week, was that the neighbors spoke to me. They asked me how I was holding up. They asked about the calving. They asked whether I needed help with the haying. Calvin and Nadine were treated with the polite reserve that small farming communities reserve for people who are technically related to a place but do not actually belong to it. Old Mr. Pritchard, who had farmed the section south of ours for 50 years, came up the porch steps and took my hand in both of his and said, "Eleanor, this farm is in good hands. It always has been." He said it loud enough for Calvin to hear. Calvin pretended not to. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I thought about my father on the porch with his jelly jar of bourbon, and about the leather satchel that had been lighter when he came out of the barn than when he had gone in. I thought about the way Roy Hollister had stood on my porch and looked out over the land. I thought about how my father had said, "There's always such a day with families like this." I did not go to the barn that night. I was not ready. I was not even sure that night that I would need to. I have always been a person who hopes, even against evidence, that people will do the right thing. 3 weeks later, at the will reading at Calvin's lawyer's office in Burlington, the Marsh family taught me what my father had already known. Section 2, the toxic figure arrives. Calvin Marsh's lawyer was a man named Wendell Hupp, and he had an office on the second floor of a brick building on Neosho Street in Burlington, Kansas, above a hardware store that had been there since I was a girl. I had never met him before that day. Calvin had selected him without consulting me, which is not how things are done when the state is being administered, but I had not pushed back, because I wanted to see what Calvin would do when given the opportunity to do as he pleased. A person reveals himself faster when he believes he is unwatched. The office had a window that looked out over the courthouse square, and the morning light came in at an angle that fell across the conference table where the 4 of us sat, Calvin at one end, Nadine and Roy together on one side, and me on the other side alone. Calvin had brought his briefcase, which he had set on the table in front of him with a small ceremonial click of the latches. Nadine had brought her purse, which she had not opened. Roy Hollister had brought a yellow legal pad and 3 sharpened pencils, which he had arranged in a row in front of him with the precision of a man who had given some thought to the staging of this particular morning. I had brought nothing. I had a folder at home, and inside the folder I had 37 years of farm records and tax filings and the original 1996 notes I had taken to courthouse, and I had not brought any of it, because I had wanted to see what they would say first. My father had taught me that you let the other side go first when you can afford to, because what they say first tells you everything about what they think they have. Wendell Hupp opened the proceedings by clearing his throat. He explained that Samuel Marsh had died intestate, meaning, he said, with no will, and that in Kansas, when a person dies intestate, the estate is distributed according to the rules of intestate succession. He explained that for a married person who dies without children, the estate ordinarily passes entirely to the surviving spouse. He said this in a flat voice, like a man reading from a manual. I felt my shoulders drop very slightly. I had known this. I had known it for years. Samuel and I had talked about it only twice. Once in our 40s, when we both got our first physicals at the same age our parents had begun dying, and once after the diagnosis. And both times we had decided that intestate was fine, because we had no children, and the law was clear, and there was nothing to fight about. The land would come to me. The cattle would come to me. The accounts would come to me. We had paid off the farm in 1989. We had owned it free and clear for 35 years. What I had not known, what I had not even imagined, was that Calvin had a different document in his briefcase. He opened the latches with that small ceremonial click again, and he took out a manila folder, and he slid across the table toward Wendell Hupp, who slid across the table to a position where everyone could see, and on top of the folder was a piece of paper that I recognized immediately, because I had filed dozens of pieces of paper exactly like in my own farm records over the years. It was a quitclaim deed. It bore Samuel's signature. It was dated in May, 3 months before Samuel had died, 2 months after my father had died, during a stretch of weeks when Samuel had been in and out of the hospital and on enough morphine that he had asked me twice whether his own father was still alive. The deed conveyed a 60% undivided interest in the Marsh family farm, 312 acres in Coffee County, Kansas, from Samuel Marsh individually to Calvin Marsh and Nadine Marsh Hollister as tenants in common. I looked at the deed for a long moment. I read it twice. I read the legal description of the property, which was the same legal description I had pulled from the courthouse in 1996, the description that did not match the original homestead instruments, the description my father had told me about on the porch with his jelly jar of bourbon. I read Samuel's signature. I read the notary stamp. The notary was a woman named Brenda Suggs, and her commission was registered in Lynn County, which is where Calvin's office was 2.5 hours from our farm, and I knew without asking that Samuel had not been driven to Lynn County in May, because in May he had not been able to walk to the bathroom without help. I did not say any of this out loud. I sat at the table in Wendell Hupp's office, and I listened to Calvin explain that Samuel had wanted to make sure the farm stayed in the Marsh family, that Samuel had come to him during one of his visits and asked him to help arrange this, that Samuel had been worried. Calvin used the word worried, that without proper structure the farm might not be managed properly going forward. Nadine nodded along. Roy Hollister wrote something on his yellow legal pad. Calvin said that the practical effect of the deed was that he and Nadine now jointly owned 60% of the property, while my interest as Samuel's surviving spouse would consist of the remaining 40%, Samuel's individual interest having been, prior to death, only 40% of the whole. He said this slowly, as though I might have trouble following the arithmetic. He said that he and Nadine had discussed the situation at length, and that they had agreed that the most equitable resolution would be for the farm to be sold and the proceeds divided, according to the new ownership structure. He said there was already a buyer interested. He said the buyer was prepared to offer fair market value, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.7 million, of which my share would be approximately $680,000. He said this was a generous outcome, all things considered. Roy Hollister cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. He said, "Of course, Eleanor, we want you to be comfortable. We've discussed among the three of us, and we'd be willing to set aside an additional $25,000 from the gross proceeds to help with your relocation. That's on top of your 40%. It's a gesture." I looked at Roy Hollister across the table. I looked at his pressed shirt and his pencils and the small expectant tilt of his head. I looked at Nadine beside him, who would not meet my eyes. I looked at Calvin at the head of the table, who was meeting my eyes in a way a man meets the eyes of someone he believes he is already beaten. I thought about Samuel in our bedroom in May, on enough morphine, that he had asked me whether his father was still alive. I thought about the notary stamp from Lynn County. I thought about my father on the porch with his jelly jar of bourbon, and the leather satchel that had been lighter when he came out of the barn. I said, "I'd like a copy of the deed, please." Wendell Hupp slid a copy across the table to me. I folded it once and put it in my coat pocket. I asked when they planned to move forward with the sale. Calvin said the closing could be arranged within 60 days. He said the buyer was an agricultural investment group out of Wichita that consolidated farmland for institutional clients, and that they were prepared to move quickly. He said the offer was strong but contingent on a clean closing, which meant, he said, this was small, careful look at me, which meant that the surviving spouse would need to sign off on the transaction in a timely manner, since Kansas law afforded certain spousal protections that could otherwise complicate the sale. I said I understood. I said I would need some time to review the documents. I said I would be in touch within the 60 days. Calvin smiled. It was a smile of a man who had expected resistance and was relieved not to be encountering it. Nadine reached across the table and put her hand briefly on mine and said, "Eleanor, this is the right thing. Samuel would have wanted this. We'll all get through it together." I did not pull my hand away. I let her have her gesture. I let all of them have whatever they needed to walk out of that office believing they had won. I drove home with the deed folded in my pocket. I drove the Tulane blacktop south out of Burlington, past the soybean fields and the cattle and the grain elevator at Gridley, and I did not cry, and I did not tremble, and I did not pull over to the shoulder. I drove at the speed limit. I noticed the way the October light fell across the fields. I noticed a red-tailed hawk on a fence post near the turnoff to our road. I have always noticed things. It is a habit my father gave me. He said you cannot read a deed if you cannot read a fence post, and you cannot read a fence post if you have never bothered to look at one. I pulled into the long gravel driveway at home a little before noon. I parked beside the kitchen porch. I took the deed out of my pocket and set it on the kitchen table. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I sat at the table where I had eaten 37 years of breakfast, and I looked at the deed in the kitchen light, and I thought about my father. The deed was a forgery. I knew it. I could not yet prove it. I could not yet prove anything. But I knew it the way you know that a calf has gotten loose 3 pastures away because the herd has gone quiet in a particular way. I knew it because Samuel had not been to Lynn County in May. I knew it because Samuel had never in 37 years done anything significant about the farm without telling me first, and he had not told me about this because he had not done it. I knew it because Calvin had brought it forward only after Samuel was dead, when there was no one left to contradict him. I also knew that knowing it and proving it were 2 different things, and that proving would take time, and that during that time Calvin would be moving forward with a buyer in Wichita, and that if I went at this the wrong way, if I hired a lawyer that afternoon and started filing motions, Calvin would close the sale before any of it could be litigated, and the buyer would have title, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to claw something back from an institutional purchaser with deeper pockets than mine. That is what the toxic ones always count on. They count on you panicking. They count on you reacting fast and loud and visible. They count on you making the kind of noise that makes you easy to dismiss as an emotional widow. My father had not raised an emotional widow. My father had raised a woman who knew how to read a deed. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup. I put on my barn coat and my work boots, and I walked out across the yard, past the chicken coop and the kitchen garden, up the slight rise to the barn that my in-laws had not yet remembered they did not own, because they had not yet remembered, in the rush of their planning, that the barn sat on a small separate parcel that had been split off the main farm in 1962 for tax reasons, and had never been merged back, and was therefore not part of the conveyance described in Calvin's forged deed at. Oh, I knew this because I had read the records. They had not. The barn door was a heavy, sliding kind, on iron tracks worn smooth by 116 years of opening and closing. I slid it open. I walked inside. The October light came through the gaps in the boards in long, pale stripes, the way light comes through old barns, and the dust moved in the air the way it always does. And I stood for a moment and let my eyes adjust. Then I walked to the north wall, and I counted 3 joists in from the corner, and I knelt down on the floor, and I began to look for what my father had left for me. Section 3, the public humiliation. The Marsh family had a tradition, going back to Samuel's grandmother's time, of hosting a harvest dinner on the 3rd Saturday of October. It was not a small gathering. 40 or 50 people came every year. Neighbors, the men who custom cut our wheat, the woman who had sold us cattle for 2 decades, the families from the church we had attended in Lebo, the county extension agent who had advised us through 3 droughts and 1 flood. We did it in the machine shed beside the barn, with long folding tables and church pews carried in for seating, and the women of the community brought side dishes, and the men carved the brisket I had smoked since the Wednesday before. It was the largest single gathering on our calendar. Samuel had always said it was the day he was proudest of the place. I had not been certain whether to hold it that year. Samuel had been dead less than 2 months. But the calls had come in beginning the second week of October. Neighbors asking gently whether I planned to do it, whether I needed help, whether they could bring something. Old Mr. Pritchard had said, "Eleanor, the farm needs it. You need it. We need it." So I had said yes, and I had ordered the brisket from the Locker plant in Burlington, and I had begun the preparation the way I had every year, and the women of the community had divided up the side dishes among themselves on a Sunday morning at church without being asked. What I had not expected, what no one had warned me about, was that Calvin and Nadine would come. They had not come to the harvest dinner in 11 years. The last time Calvin had come was the year of Samuel's 50th birthday, when he had stayed for 90 minutes and left before dessert. The last time Nadine had come was 3 years before that, when their mother had still been alive and the gathering had been part of a longer family weekend. Their absence at the harvest dinner had become so reliable that I had stopped setting places for them. That Saturday morning, at a little after 10, Calvin's silver Lexus pulled up the drive, followed by Roy Hollister's white Cadillac. Nadine got out of the Cadillac in a navy blue dress that was too formal for a farm gathering, and Roy got out behind her with a covered dish that I could see from across the yard had come from a grocery store deli. Calvin got out of the Lexus alone, in pressed khakis and a blazer, and he walked up to the porch where I was standing wiping my hands on my apron, and he kissed me on the cheek in front of the first 3 guests who had already arrived, and he said loudly, "Eleanor, we wanted to be here today, to support you, to support the family." I understood, in that single sentence, what the day was about to become. By noon, there were 43 people in the machine shed. The brisket was carved. The side dishes were set out. The folding tables were full. Calvin had been moving through the crowd for nearly 2 hours by then, shaking hands, accepting condolences for Samuel as though he had been the one who buried him, talking to the men who had farmed beside us for 40 years as though himself had ever picked up a wrench in his life. Nadine was beside him. Roy hovered behind them with his hands clasped at his belt, which is a posture of a man who does not know what to do at a farm gathering, but believes himself to be necessary to it. I let it go on. I served. I sat. I listened to the prayer that Pastor Coleman gave from the head of the long table, and I bowed my head the way I had bowed my head at this gathering for 37 Octobers, and I said, "Amen." I did not interrupt Calvin. I did not redirect anyone's attention. I let the family present itself the way the family wanted to present itself. In the way you let a man speak who is digging a hole he does not know is a hole. Calvin stood up after the meal. He picked up a glass of iced tea and tapped it with a butter knife. A thing I have never in my life seen done at a Coffee County harvest dinner. A thing that belongs to the kind of wedding reception where people give long toasts about themselves. And he waited until the room had quieted. And he said he wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being here, and to thank Eleanor for keeping the family tradition alive in this difficult year. People nodded. Old Mr. Pritchard raised his glass to me from the second table. I nodded back. Calvin said that he and Nadine had something they wanted to share with the community. He said that Samuel, in his last months, had thought a great deal about the future of the farm, and had taken steps to ensure that it would be properly cared for going forward. He said that the family had been working, since Samuel's death, on a transition that would honor Samuel's wishes and provide the right kind of stewardship for the next chapter of the property's history. I felt the room shift. I felt old Mr. Pritchard turn his head slightly toward me. I felt a current of attention move across the long tables, the way attention moves in a small community when a person is saying something that does not match the story everyone has been told. Calvin said that the farm would be transitioning, in the coming months, to a new ownership and management structure. He said that he and Nadine, as the surviving siblings of Samuel Marsh, would be working with an agricultural partner out of Wichita to ensure that the land continued to produce at its highest potential. He said that Eleanor, and here he turned and gestured toward me at my table, would be entering a new chapter of her own life, and that the family was committed to making that transition as comfortable as possible. He said it the way you say a thing in front of witnesses, to make it harder for the person you are saying it about to contradict you later. Nadine stood up beside him. She said, in her best church circle voice, "We just want everyone to know that Eleanor will always be a part of this family. We've already discussed setting her up in a nice place in town, close to her friends, where she won't have to worry about the burden of a working farm at her age. The room was completely silent. I have been at funerals that were less silent than that machine shed at 12:43 on the third Saturday of October. Roy Hollister, who has never read a room in his life, took the silence as an invitation. He stood up from his chair, and he turned toward me, and he said, in the cheerful tone of a man wrapping up a presentation at a banker's lunch, "Eleanor, we know this is a lot, but we also know that you've earned a rest. The barn alone, we were just talking about it this morning, weren't we, Calvin? The barn alone is going to need more work than any one person ought to be taking on. So as part of the transition, we'd like to formally hand the barn parcel over to you, free and clear, a keepsake, something to remember Samuel by." Calvin laughed. It was the wrong kind of laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has not noticed that his audience has gone cold. He said, "That's right, Ellie. The barn's all yours. You enjoy it." Nadine laughed too, smaller, behind her hand. Old Mr. Pritchard set down his fork. I felt 43 people watching me. I felt the weight of every harvest dinner I had ever served in that machine shed. I felt the weight of the deed in my coat pocket. I had been carrying it folded there for 3 weeks by then, and I felt the weight of my father on the porch with his jelly jar of bourbon, and the weight of the leather satchel that had been lighter when he came out of the barn. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. My father had taught me that a person who has to raise her voice has already lost the argument. I said, "Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Roy. I appreciate the gesture." I said, "I accept the barn." I said, "I'll need it in writing." Calvin blinked. He had not expected that. He had expected tears or a scene or a quiet collapse into agreement. He had not expected the widow to reach into her purse and pull out a pen. Roy Hollister, recovering faster than Calvin, said, of course, we can have something drawn up Monday morning." I said, "I'd like it today. I'd like it on paper, signed by both of you, witnessed by Mr. Pritchard and Pastor Coleman. A simple statement that the parcel containing the north barn, the parcel that was split off in 1962 for tax purposes and has never been remerged, is being conveyed by Calvin Marsh and Nadine Marsh Hollister to Eleanor Marsh, free and clear, in front of these witnesses on this date." The room was no longer silent. It had gone past silent into the particular quality of attention that gathers when 43 people have understood, all at once, that they are watching something they do not yet have a name for. Old Mr. Pritchard stood up from his bench. He said, "I'll witness it." Pastor Coleman stood up from the head table. He said, "I'll witness it too." Calvin's face had begun to do something complicated. He had not anticipated the 1962 split. He had not anticipated that I knew about the 1962 split. He had assumed, the way men like Calvin always assume, that I had spent 37 years on this farm without ever bothering to learn what I owned. He looked at Nadine. Nadine looked at Roy. Roy, to his credit, understood faster than either of them that they could not now back out of the gesture they had made in front of the entire community without looking like exactly what they were. I had a piece of paper in my apron pocket. I had put it there that morning. I had drafted it at my kitchen table the night before in the careful hand my father had taught me, and I had brought it to the harvest dinner because I had suspected, not known, suspected, that Calvin and Nadine would not be able to resist a public moment. People like that never can. I unfolded the paper. I set it on the long table. I held out the pen. Calvin signed. Nadine signed. Old Mr. Pritchard signed as witness, and Pastor Coleman signed as witness, and Roy Hollister, who could not stop himself, signed underneath as a third witness, even though no one had asked him to. I folded the paper. I put it back in my apron pocket. I sat down. I picked up my fork. I took another bite of brisket. Calvin and Nadine left within 20 minutes. They did not stay for dessert. Roy Hollister followed them out with the empty grocery store deli dish, and the white Cadillac and the silver Lexus pulled out of my driveway one after the other, and old Mr. Pritchard came over and put his hand on my shoulder, and he did not say anything because he did not need to. That evening, after the last folding table had been put away and the last guest had driven home, I sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun go down over the bur oaks. The signed paper was on the kitchen table beside the forged deed. 2 pieces of paper, 2 different futures. I did not yet know everything that was in the barn. I knew only what my father had told me. The 3rd joist from the north wall, 2 boards back. Something he had left, and something that had already been there before he left his. The next morning, at first light, I went to find both. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. Section 4 of the investigation. The barn was older than anything else on the property. Samuel's great-grandfather, Absalom Marsh, had built it in 1908, the same year as the house, but on a foundation of cut limestone that had been laid down as part of an earlier structure in the 1880s, before the Marshes had owned the place at all. The original homestead patent on the parcel had been issued in 1873 to a man named Jeremiah Caldwell, and that was a name I had stopped at the first time I had read in the courthouse in 1996, because Caldwell was my father's name, and Jeremiah Caldwell, according to the family Bible my father kept in a drawer at his bureau in Lincoln County, had been my father's great-grandfather. My father's family and Samuel's family had farmed the same Kansas county 150 years ago. I had not known this when I married Samuel. My father had known it. He had not told me. He had, instead, told me about the 3rd joist from the north wall. I knelt on the floor of the barn at first light on Sunday morning, with a flashlight and a pry bar and a pair of leather gloves, and I counted 3 joists in from the north corner. The joists were rough-hewn hand-axe from local oak. You can tell hand-axed oak from sawmill oak by the way the grain is broken rather than cut, and the floorboard above them were tongue and groove pine, original to the 1908 construction, dark with 116 years of cattle and grain dust and the slow oxidation of softwood that has never been sealed. I counted back 2 boards from the joist. I ran my gloved hand along the seam. The seam felt the same as every other seam in the barn, until I reached a point about 18 inches from the north wall, where the seam was not quite as clean. The board on the inside of that section had been lifted at some point and replaced. You could see it if you knew to look. The wood was the same age, but the cut was a little crisper, and the nails were finishing nails rather than the cut nails my husband's great-grandfather would have used. I worked the pry bar into the seam. The board came up. Beneath it was a space the size of a large cigar box, dug out of the dirt that lay between the joists, lined with a piece of canvas that had been waterproof with what smelled like beeswax and pine resin, a method I knew because my father had taught me to waterproof the seams of grain bins the same way. Inside the canvas was a flat tin box, the kind of tin box that held loose tobacco in the 1920s, latched with a small brass clasp. Inside the tin box was a folded oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth were 3 things. The first was a letter in my father's handwriting, sealed in an envelope addressed to me. The second was a sheaf of legal documents, fastened with a brass paper clip, that I recognized immediately by their format as instruments filed with the Coffee County Register of Deeds. The third was a smaller, much older envelope. The paper yellowed almost brown, the wax seal cracked, the handwriting on the front in a copperplate script that had not been used in this part of the country since the 1890s. I sat down on the barn floor with my back against the north wall, and I read my father's letter first. "Eleanor," he wrote, "if you are reading this, then the day I worried about has come. I am sorry for it. I have been sorry for it for as long as you have been married to Samuel Marsh, which I want you to know does not mean I have been sorry for the marriage. Samuel was a good man. The marriage was a good one. I have been sorry only for what I knew about his family that he himself never knew, and that I did not tell you, because I did not want to be the man who poisoned the thing that was making you happy. Here is what you need to know. Your great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah Caldwell, took out the original homestead on the parcel that is now the Marsh Farm in 1873. He proved up the patent in 1878. He raised 3 children on that land, including your great-grandfather Thomas Caldwell, who farmed it until 1889, when a series of bad wheat years and a dispute with a railroad over right-of-way assessments forced him to sell. He sold it to Absalom Marsh, your husband's great-grandfather, for a price that was lower than the land was worth, on terms that included a continuing royalty on any subsurface mineral extraction, paid by the buyer to the seller and to the seller's heirs in perpetuity. This royalty was recorded as an attachment to the deed of sale, filed at the Coffee County Courthouse on November 14, 1889. The royalty was never paid out because no minerals were ever extracted. By the 1920s, the document had been forgotten. By the 1950s, it had been physically separated from the main deed file at the courthouse due to a reorganization of the records, and the attachment was filed in a separate volume that has not been pulled by anyone in 70 years. I know this because I went and looked in the spring of 1989, the year you and Samuel paid off the mortgage. I went without telling you. The attachment is still there. It is still legally in force. It has never been released, and it cannot be released without the signed consent of the heirs of Jeremiah Caldwell, which, Eleanor, is you. You are the last living heir in a direct line. That is the first thing. The second thing is that in 1962, Samuel's father, John Marsh, split a small parcel off the main farm for tax purposes, the parcel that contains a north barn and approximately 4 acres of surrounding ground. The split was filed correctly. The reunification was never filed at all. John Marsh meant to merge the parcels back when the tax situation cleared, but he died in 1971 before he got around to it, and no one in the family ever noticed. The barn parcel has been a separate legal entity for 62 years. Any conveyance of the main farm that does not specifically include the barn parcel does not include the barn. The third thing is in the older envelope in this box. It is the original 1889 royalty attachment, with the seller's signature, the buyer's signature, and the county clerk's filing stamp. I made a certified copy at the courthouse in 1989 and left the original in the volume where it belonged. But in 2017, I went back, and the volume was about to be moved into off-site storage as part of a digitization project. I asked the clerk, an old friend of mine named Carl Whitney, whether I could keep the original, since I was the named heir's father and the document had been gathering dust for a century and a quarter. Carl said yes. He filed a memorandum in the volume noting that the original had been withdrawn into the custody of the heir, and he replaced it with a notarized copy. Both the original and the certified copy are in this box. Eleanor, this farm has been your family's land since 1873. The Marsh family has been holding it on terms that include a continuing obligation to your line. They do not know this. They have never known this. I did not tell Samuel because I did not want him to feel that his marriage to you was somehow a settlement of a debt, which it was not, and which you both deserve to be free of. But if Calvin and Nadine come for what is yours, and I have watched them long enough to know that they will, you have everything you need in this box to defend yourself. Take it to a lawyer named Patricia Dorr in Emporia. She handled my father's estate. She is honest, she is sharp, and she knows her way through a Kansas land dispute the way some people know their way around a kitchen. I love you, Eleanor. I have always loved you. I am sorry I could not tell you any of this in person. There never seemed to be a good time, and now there isn't a time at all. Your father, Henry Caldwell. I read the letter twice. Then I read it a third time. I sat for a long while with my back against the north wall of the barn, and the early light coming into the gaps in the boards, and I thought about my father walking these fence lines twice in the first decade of my marriage. I thought about him standing at the southwest corner where the creek runs through, on land his great-grandfather had homesteaded, married now to a man whose family had bought it from his own. I thought about him on the porch with his jelly jar of bourbon, saying this is good ground. This is better ground than they understand. And I understood that he had not been talking about the soil. I opened the older envelope. The 1889 royalty attachment was 3 pages long, handwritten in copperplate on heavy rag paper, with the original red wax seal of the Coffee County Register of Deeds embossed into the lower corner of the 3rd page. The buyer's signature was Absalom Marsh in a careful schoolhouse hand. The seller's signature was Thomas Caldwell in a slightly looser hand, with the same small leftward slant my father had in his own writing and that I have in mine. The royalty terms were unambiguous. 5% of the gross value of any subsurface mineral, oil, gas, or hydrocarbon extracted from the property described in the attached deed of sale, payable quarterly, in perpetuity, to Thomas Caldwell and his heirs in fee simple, with the obligation running with the land and binding upon all subsequent owners and grantees. There was no termination clause. There was no expiration. The document had been recorded, stamped, and filed. I knew, without having to look, that there had been 3 new oil and gas leases signed on the section north of ours in the past 4 years. I had heard about them at the grain elevator. The Mississippian lime play had been working its way into eastern Kansas since 2018, and the section north of us had begun producing in late 2021. I knew, because farmers in Coffee County talked to one another, that the wells on the neighboring section were grossing somewhere between $18,000 and $20,000 a month per well, and that there were currently 4 wells. I also knew, because I had read the geology reports my husband had requested in 2019 when the leasing agents had first come through, that the same formation underlay the Marsh Farm, and that Calvin and Nadine had been quietly negotiating with the same operating company for the last 14 months. I knew this because the operating company's land agent had stopped by the farm in August, looking for Samuel, and when I had told him Samuel was too sick to talk, he had asked whether he could speak with Calvin Marsh in Kansas City, because that was a contact he had been told to use. I had not known what to make of that conversation in August. I knew what to make of it now. I closed the tin box. I put it in a canvas bag I had brought out from the kitchen. I walked back to the house. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I picked up the phone, and I called Patricia Dorr's office in Emporia, and I left a message with her receptionist that I would like to schedule an appointment as soon as her schedule allowed. She called me back in 40 minutes. I sat with Patricia Dorr in her office on the second floor of a converted Victorian house in Emporia 3 days later. She was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair cut short and a pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a way of looking at a document that reminded me exactly of my father reading a fence post. She did not interrupt me while I told her the story. She did not interrupt me when I laid the contents of the tin box on her desk, one item at a time, in the order my father had arranged them. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Marsh, your father was a careful man." I said he had been. She said, "We can use this." She said it the way a doctor says we can treat this. Not as a promise, but as a fact. She said the forward deed could be challenged on multiple grounds: the timing, the notary jurisdiction, Samuel's medical condition during the alleged signing, the absence of any contemporaneous communication with me as a spouse. She said the barn parcel transfer, witnessed by Pritchard and Coleman, was bulletproof. She said the 1889 royalty attachment was a genuine instrument of considerable interest, and that the operating company on the neighboring section would be very motivated to have its status clarified before any wells were drilled on the Marsh Farm. She said the combination of the 3 would put me in an extremely strong position, and that if I was willing to be patient and to let her work, she could resolve the entire matter without a single courtroom appearance. She said, "Are you in a hurry?" I said I was not. She said, "Good. Neither am I. Neither, frankly, are they. They think they have 60 days. We have as long as we need." I left her office at 3 in the afternoon. The drive back to the farm took an hour. I did not turn the radio on. I drove past the soybean fields and the cattle, and I noticed the way the November light had begun to slant lower across the fields, and I thought about my father walking the fence lines, and about the leather satchel under his arm, and about 135 years of paper waiting in a tin box for the right person to open it. The investigation was over. The case was made. What was left was the delivery, and Patricia Dorr was going to deliver it in a way that none of them would ever forget. Section 5, the solution. The closing on the sale of the Marsh Farm was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday of December at the offices of Wendell Hupp in Burlington. The buyer's representatives were flying in from Wichita that morning. Calvin had arranged for a notary, a title insurance agent, and a representative from the operating company's land department to be present in order to handle, simultaneously with the sale, the signing of an oil and gas lease that would transfer drilling rights on the Marsh Farm to the operating company effective at closing. Calvin had not mentioned the oil and gas lease to me. I knew about it because Patricia Dorr had requested copies of the buyer's closing documents 3 weeks earlier under a routine title clearance protocol, and the buyer's law firm had sent everything over without asking why. Patricia and I drove up to Burlington together. We arrived 20 minutes early. We sat in the parking lot of the courthouse square in her car, and she went over the order of the morning with me one more time. She had a slim leather portfolio on her lap. Inside the portfolio were 9 documents, organized in a sequence she had spent 2 hours arranging the night before. I asked her if she was ready. She said she had been ready for 30 years. We walked into Wendell Hupp's office at 5 minutes to 9. The room was already full. Calvin was at the head of the conference table, in a charcoal suit. Nadine and Roy were on one side of the table. The buyer's representatives, a man named Philip Renner from the Wichita firm, and a woman named Catherine Stoll from their title insurance carrier, were on the other side. The land department representative from the operating company, a man named Doug Henley, was at the far end of the table with a stack of leased documents in front of him. Wendell Hupp was at his usual place, with a yellow legal pad and a freshly sharpened pencil. The mood in the room was a particular kind of mood that gathers in real estate closings, the low hum of a transaction that had been arranged, papered, and is about to consummate itself with a series of signatures. Calvin looked up when Patricia and I walked in. His face did something complicated. He had not expected me to bring counsel. He had expected me to walk in alone, the way a widow walks in alone, and to sit at the seat that had been reserved for me, and to sign where Wendell Hupp pointed. Patricia walked to the table. She did not sit down. She set her portfolio on the table, and she remained standing, and she introduced herself to the room. She said, "Good morning. My name is Patricia Dorr. I represent Mrs. Eleanor Marsh. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce 9 documents that bear on this transaction, with the chair's permission." Wendell Hupp blinked. Wendell Hupp was a competent attorney, but he had not been in many rooms with Patricia Dorr. He said, "Of course, counselor." She opened the portfolio. The first document was a harvest dinner conveyance, the simple paper, signed by Calvin and Nadine in front of Pritchard and Coleman, transferring the barn parcel to me. Patricia laid it on the table. She said, "This document, signed and witnessed on October 19th, conveys a parcel containing the north barn and approximately 4 acres of surrounding ground from Calvin Marsh and Nadine Marsh Hollister to Eleanor Marsh. The parcel was split off the main Marsh farm in 1962 and was never emerged. It is a separate legal entity. It is now owned by my client." Roy Hollister opened his mouth. Patricia did not look at him. She said, "Mr. Renner, I want to draw your attention to the legal description in your purchase contract. The description corresponds to the main Marsh farm parcel as last surveyed in 1973. It does not include the 1962 split. The seller cannot convey the barn parcel under your contract because the seller does not own the barn parcel. My client owns it. This is not a minor detail. Approximately 1 acre of road frontage along the north property line falls inside the barn parcel, including the only legal access point for any drilling rig that would need to reach the central portion of the property." Doug Henley, the operating company's land agent, sat up very straight. The second document was a 1962 split filing, with a highlighted section showing the legal description. The third document was an aerial survey, showing the road frontage and the access point. The fourth document was a letter from Patricia's office, dated a week before, formally notifying the operating company that any oil and gas lease covering the main Marsh farm would be unable to access the central drilling locations without an easement from the barn parcel, an easement that, the letter noted, my client was not prepared to grant under current proposed lease terms. Doug Henley looked at Philip Renner. Philip Renner looked at Calvin. Calvin's face had begun to do something that was no longer complicated. It had simplified. Patricia laid down the fifth document. She said, "This is the original quitclaim deed presented at the will reading on October 1st, conveying a 60% undivided interest in the Marsh farm from Samuel Marsh to Calvin Marsh and Nadine Marsh Hollister. The deed is dated May 14th of this year. It bears a notarial seal of Brenda Suggs, commissioned in Lynn County, Kansas." She laid down the sixth document. She said, "This is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Marcus Holloway, Samuel Marsh's attending oncologist at the Stormont Vale Cancer Center, stating that on May 14th of this year, Samuel Marsh was an inpatient at the Stormont Vale facility in Topeka, undergoing his 4th round of palliative chemotherapy, and was at no point during that day discharged from the facility or transported to Lynn County or anywhere else. Dr. Holloway has reviewed the medical records, the visitor logs, and the nursing shift notes for that date. He is prepared to testify under oath to the contents of this affidavit." She laid down the seventh document. She said, "This is a printout of a deposition transcript from Brenda Suggs, the notary on the quitclaim deed. The deposition was conducted by my office on November 12th. Ms. Suggs has stated, under oath, that she does not recall meeting Samuel Marsh, that she does not recall notarizing the document in question, and that the signature attributed to her on the deed is consistent with her stamp but inconsistent with her handwriting. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.